Hello, and welcome back to Dystopia Now. I am Kate Willett.
I'm Emil Torres.
Today we're going to talk about a man who was the sexiest man alive on the internet around 2018. He was capturing the hearts of all the young hetero ladies, and that is Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber himself.
For a moment there, I was wondering if you had changed topics for this episode. Wait, am I unprepared?
You don't remember that when people decided that the Unabomber was hot?
I don't remember that. No. Did that actually happen?
Oh, yeah. It was all over Twitter, probably around 2018.
How did I miss
that? The Unabomber was hot. The Unabomber was right. People had the Unabomber, suspect drawing printed on, sweatshirts and stuff. It was a whole meme. People were, really... it's interesting because I think a similar kind of thing happened with... Osama bin Laden in maybe it was probably 2 years ago at this point that the TikTok teens found his manifesto and were like, actually, this guy was right about some things. But I think that I think that with the Unabomber, people kind of got into this sort of hey, maybe he was right about some stuff. Maybe we should all go live in the woods. Maybe technology really is evil.
Yeah.
And, it's like an understandable impulse, I think, an understandable reaction to the types of situations that we're seeing now with AI. And I don't want to speak for you, but I would say for myself that I think there were some problems with the Unabomber's logic. I don't think he got it all right.
Yeah, don't speak for me.
Yeah, but this is kind of a tech critical show. And so we thought for today it might be fun to explore where are our points of alignment, and also where did he take it to places that really we don't think are the best.
Yeah. And also, what is his surprising connection to the early TESCREAL movement, right?
Yeah.
He in a sense, we'll talk about this in detail later on, he inspired a number of leading intellectuals and technologists to be more critical about the megatechnics of industrial civilization. And those individuals, these tech people and intellectuals and so on, had active public debates with some of the most noted, most influential early TESCREAlists. So there's a really interesting history there that nobody's really explored before. So hopefully we will touch on some interesting and novel ideas that shed some light on the early development evolution of the TESCREAL movement.
Yeah, I mean, look, some of these people that you talk about, our last episode with Ray Kurzweil, I'm like, maybe I should move to the woods. I'm not going to mail anyone bombs, mostly because I hate going to the post office. I just had to do it this morning. By the way, international listeners who got some stickers from our Patreon, all of our international mail has now gone out. But anyway, I don't think that it's a good idea to become the Unabomber, but I get having an extreme reaction, an extreme disgust to the types of things we're seeing, especially for Ted Kaczynski. He was around all these folks. He graduated from Harvard. He probably knew a lot of these people in real life. So, he was dealing with their annoying, arrogant nature in a way that's much more personal than, what I'm dealing with. Anyway, I know, Emil, you have met a lot of these folks in real life as well.
I have, yes.
So let's go into a little bit of just Ted Kaczynski's bio, and then we will explore his ideology and his connections to TESCREAL. I was thinking that it would be really funny if we did discover that there was another podcast who talked about his connections to TESCREAL. That would be amazing, but we're not there yet. This is the foremost TESCREAL critical podcast. Yeah. Okay. So Ted Kaczynski's full name, Theodore John Kaczynski, aka the Unabomber. He was a math prodigy. who got a start in academia, and he opted to pursue a reclusive, primitive lifestyle. Obviously committed terrible crimes. He murdered 3 people, injured 23 other people. His Unabombing campaign was between 1978 and 1995. So I remember this was big stuff when I was a child. I remember seeing this all over the news.
Yeah.
And he conducted a nationwide mail bombing campaign against people that he thought were advancing technology and the destruction of nature. He wrote a really...
And at first, the target was individuals in at universities and airlines. So that's how he got the Unabomber name, University Airline Bomber.
And people were like, the feds were really confused because at first they didn't think that these victims had anything in common with each other. They were like, what the fuck is going on? And, we're just like, it felt random, right? So anyway, he grew up in the Chicago area. His parents were, kind of, there's nothing like kind of notable or extraordinarily bad about them, at least that we know, He went to elementary school in Chicago, was always really smart. He played the trombone. He had a brother. Nobody really thought that this guy was like, super strange other than the fact that he was very smart. He skipped 11th grade, graduated high school at age 15. When he was 15, he got accepted to Harvard, and he was accepted on scholarship. He started at 16, goes into Harvard. He's like this crazy math wizard. He lived in Eliot House, which was like a house with other students. He had a pretty good grades. He was described as like really smart, but somewhat reserved. And then in his second year, he participates in a study by Harvard psychologist Henry Murray. So in the study, students were told that they would be debating philosophy with a fellow student and were asked to write essays debating or detailing their personal beliefs. And the essays were given to an anonymous individual who would review the subject and belittle it. So he...
I mean, the guy who ran...
Do you know anything about this study?
Yeah, I know a little bit. Murray has described the point of the study was to have people like Kaczynski write essays, and then they would be very harshly criticized, right? And so Murray himself said that he described the punishment as vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive. Those were the sorts of attacks that were directed towards the participants. This was many decades ago, before there were like ethics boards, right? Before there were committees that were tasked, the task was delegated to them to ensure the ethicality of whatever the experiment is, if it includes human participants, right? Because of the possibility of psychological damage, trauma, PTSD, and so on. So yeah, back when there were no rules about this. This study was conducted. Kaczynski was one of the individuals who was subjected to all of this abuse. I think he spent 200 hours participating in the study, and so some people have speculated that this may at least partially explain his homicidal behavior later in life.
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of what I got out of his bio is that it doesn't seem like there is like a super one-for-one explanation. Like it's not, it's not a bio where you see like, oh, his dad was a, murderer or something like that. Or, I mean, like he seems like he, other than being, very advanced academically for his age, was like fairly normal, but obviously maybe not inside. So anyways, after he graduates from Harvard, He enrolls at the University of Michigan, gets his master's degree and a doctoral degree in mathematics. He also applied to Berkeley, but they didn't give him, enough financial aid or teaching positions. He's going along. He doesn't like Michigan. Seems kind of unhappy there. In 1966, he considers gender transition. He meets with a psychiatrist and he talks about how he wants to transition, and then he changes his mind after. Just reading between the lines, it seems like this was possibly another traumatic incident for him that, his feelings, obviously this is a very different time. It doesn't seem like he was, met with acceptance and support for these questions on his mind.
And also, my understanding is that when he got to Harvard, as you mentioned before, he was a very young guy, younger than many of the other undergraduates in his cohort, and so that the difficulty of like fitting in and establishing robust interpersonal relations, friendships, etc. That may have also contributed to a sense of alienation. And then you have that psychological study that he participated in. And so all of these factors could, like I said before, to some extent explain perhaps his disposition to engage in violence later on.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't even gotten into the weird part yet, but he just certainly did engage in violence. So in 1967, he becomes an assistant professor at Berkeley, which is where I went to school. He resigns without explanation in 1969. His colleagues are really surprised by it. They don't really understand why. In 1996, reporters for the LA Times interviewed other mathematicians about Kaczynski's work, and they said, hey, without this guy, this whole subfield of mathematics is gone. So he's really good at math. So after he leaves Berkeley, he moves back to his parents' home. And in 1971, he moves to a remote cabin. And this is where, we think about the Unabomber's accommodations. This cabin is this is a very famous cabin. This is where he's trying to live some version of the anarcho-primitivist, or maybe not anarcho, I don't know. We'll talk about his politics later, but
we'll talk
he lives
about that
in a cabin.
In a moment. But I'll add real fast that he was not an anarcho-primitivist. He was a neo-Luddite who had an issue with industrialization and what he called organization-dependent. I can't remember the exact term, but organization-dependent technologies, like large-scale technologies. But he had a really interesting and complex relationship with the environmentalist movement. I know some environmentalists have said that he wasn't one of them. Right.
Yeah.
And he does talk in his manifesto. We'll discuss this more momentarily about environmentalism and the importance from his perspective of preserving nature and so on. But I mean, the main focus seemed to be things like freedom, as opposed to ensuring that ecosystems remain intact and there isn't deforestation. I mean, he was opposed to deforestation, but I think mostly because he thought that deforestation is the result of industrialization, and industrialization is bad for freedom. And also, he just wanted peace. He wanted to be, alone and in a quiet state, where he's not being bothered by traffic noise and airplanes and so on. So these were sort of I'm trying to distinguish here between his particular idiosyncratic focus and the broader environmentalist movement, which was really booming. Ever since the modern environmentalist movement started in 1970 with the first Earth Day event, and it was really booming. Throughout the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, when Kaczynski was engaged in his campaign of domestic terrorism. Okay, so back to what you were saying.
Well, I mean, I think, no, that's good context because I think one thing that we'll get into a little bit more later is that this guy's not a leftist. I think that, he got some praise. Probably a lot of it was ironic on the left, for being like, this guy that, hated technology, corporations or whatever. But like, I think that his current lineage has much more similarity to like some of these kind of like right-wing return grifters, in my opinion. All right. So he's in the cabin. He's living completely autonomously. He's a bike. The census comes by one day, and the census describes this cabin as containing a bed, 2 chairs, storage trunks, a gas stove, and a lot of books. So in 1975, he starts making booby traps near his cabin and does some arson. It's kind of like if the Home Alone kid was an adult, from what I understand.
Never thought about it that way.
But so it seems like he's getting like more and more paranoid out there. He's not getting a lot of feedback on these ideas. In the 80s and 90s, Kaczynski's neighbors start to suspect him of attacking and poisoning their dogs.
That gets
and later
to the peace
he
and
admits
quiet
to killing one
part
dog.
that I was referencing a moment ago. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, seriously, you want to make me hate you? Hurt an animal. I hate people who hurt animals. So,
but he also killed 3 people. Do people count less to you than animals?
That's very bad too, and I would say it's actually worse. But there is some way that like hurting a tiny, tiny, tiny defenseless animal just does. I don't know. It evokes some kind of visceral rage in me. I'm just I'm an animal lover, and I'm not like, look, obviously murder is worse. Okay, so except for maybe to our vegan listeners who were with me on that first one. I don't know, but so his bombings start between 1978 and 1995. So he mails or hand delivers a series of bombs that are increasing in sophistication. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, kills 3 people, injures 23 others. They think he sent out 16 bombs, but there could be more. So a lot of the bombing devices contain the initials FC, which he said stood for Freedom Club. So he left like a lot of misleading clues, and I remember that this was all over the news, people trying to figure out like who's doing this, like who is this guy. So in his bombing victims, his first bomb victim was someone named Buckley Christ, a professor of engineering at Northwestern, and his second bomb was sent a year later, again to Northwestern. It was concealed in a cigar box and caused injuries to a graduate student named John Harris. So in 1975, there's a bomb in the cargo hold of an American Airlines flight from Chicago to Washington, D.C. The bomb releases smoke. The pilots do an emergency landing. Apparently, this bomb is strong enough to obliterate the whole plane. But luckily they were able to do an emergency landing.
So he very easily could have killed 100 people, right?
Yeah,
in that one
intended to.
Yeah, absolutely.
In 1981, he mails another bomb. The return address says Brigham Young University, which is BYU. It's a Mormon school. in Utah. It's discovered at the University of Utah. I like how he's trying to play it off like it's some like intercollegiate rivalry, like it's BYU versus University of Utah.
Yeah.
So luckily, the campus police catch the situation, and it was diffused by a bomb squad. You're not going to hear me praise the police on this show. Just glad that people didn't die. So his next two bombs target UC Berkeley again. In 1982, an engineering professor named Diogenes Angelakos was injured. 3 years later, John Hauser, a grad student and Air Force captain, lost 4 fingers and went blind in one eye. Kaczynski was handcrafting these bombs. In 1985, there's a nail and splinter bomb in the parking lot of a computer store that kills the 38-year-old store owner, Hugh Scruton. In 1993, in 1997, there was a bomb disguised as a piece of lumber that injured someone named Gary Wright. And then Kaczynski goes on a break for a while. He takes some time for himself, out there in the woods, and he starts the bombs again.
So I think he went silent because somebody saw him place a bomb in a parking lot, I believe, or it might have been like next to a building or something. So the FBI actually drew a composite of his face. Right. And so that was released to the public. And my understanding is that spooked him. And so he went quiet for a number of years. And the FBI was really hoping that either he had died or he had gotten arrested for some other unrelated offense and, was behind bars and hence not continuing to perpetrate these acts of domestic terrorism. And then it was a series of events like the Waco siege that happened in Texas, as well as the bombing in, I think it was 1991, of the World Trade Center, right? So this was the first terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, and those events sort of created an atmosphere of anxiety. He was looking for in atmosphere in which there is anxiety and panic and so on, because he as he makes clear in his manifesto, the more society is kind of destabilized, the more vulnerable it becomes for some kind of revolt, right? So I think he felt inspired in that moment, given that everybody was reeling from these two American tragedies. He felt inspired then to restart his bombing campaign. And sort of got over his prior nervousness about having been seen once, even though the photo that was produced of him doesn't really look like him, but I guess it's close enough.
Is this the famous one?
Yes,
the really famous one with the orange jacket.
Yeah, with his.
It doesn't look like him
glasses.
that much. Yeah. So as we mentioned, in 1993, he mails a bomb to Professor Charles Epstein from UCSF. Epstein is severely injured, loses several fingers opening the package. He mails a bomb to another professor of computer science, David Gerlenter, who's a professor at Yale. Gerlenter loses an eye, loses hearing in one of his ears, and loses a portion of his right hand, just terrible injuries. In 1994, a executive named Thomas Mosser was killed opening a bomb from Kaczynski to his home in New Jersey. And in 1995, Gilbert Brant Murray, who is president of the Timber Industry Lobbying Group, California Forestry Association, was killed by a mail bomb who was addressed actually to someone else, the previous president, William Dennison, who had already retired. And anyway, Kaczynski publishes his manifesto, which we'll get into, in 1995. He sends it to a bunch of different media outlets.
Washington Post, and then the New York Times, and then there was another, I think, Adult Magazine or something that he sent it to. But his deal, in previous letters that he had sent, he claimed that if these outlets would publish his manifesto, he would stop. He would cease his campaign of terror. So ultimately, it seems like I don't know when he realized that he might be able to use his campaign of terror as a kind of lever to force these outlets with huge audiences to publish his article. I don't know when he realized like that was a possibility. I don't think that was the plan from the start, but it ultimately, bombing campaign was used in that manner. That was the way that he got his manifesto out there, right? Nobody would have paid attention to it otherwise. In fact, he had written a similar manifesto, which I think was much shorter. It was something like 28 pages, and sent it to his brother David Kaczynski. I think he like maybe tried to publish it or something, and he wasn't able to. So ultimately, it was that earlier manifesto, that much shorter manifesto, that enabled David to later realize that the likely author of what we now know as the Unabomber Manifesto was very likely written by Ted. So,
well, it's so hard to make it as a writer, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, like, you can say a lot of things about the Unabomber, but he had hustle, you know? Like, an interesting thing about this is the Attorney General under Bill Clinton, Janet Reno, and the FBI director really wanted this published.
Yeah.
They recommended the publication because they thought that, it would help potentially identify the author.
Yeah.
And
that was exactly the case, right? I mean, they
Yes.
literally said, okay, here's a guy who has been formulating his ideas for decades. And surely somebody is going to read
knows him.
the manifesto and go like, oh yeah, there was a guy who I sat next to in class at some university who was saying basically the same thing. Or maybe perhaps there are like idiosyncratic phrases that might give it away. And in fact, there were some idiosyncratic phrases. I think, I can't remember off the top of my head what it was exactly. I think it was cool-headed logician, which appears in that shorter manifesto sent to David Kaczynski, as well as the much longer 35,000-word Unabomber Manifesto.
It's so funny. A funny detail about this is that Penthouse volunteered to publish the manifesto, but Kaczynski replied that Penthouse was less respectable.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to remember. It was Penthouse.
Yeah. He's like, well, I don't want to be in a porno mag.
Yeah.
He was really holding out for the New York Times or the Washington Post. So anyway, there's a huge investigation of trying to enormous federal resources to find the Unabomber. It's interesting thinking about this in the context of this time, because this struck me as a fairly competent effort.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to stay on law enforcement, but it seems like they tried to find this guy who was hurting people, and they did.
Yeah.
Looking at like it's impossible to imagine like the Trump administration doing something like this.
Yeah.
The Trump administration would be like, going after like a random undocumented person from Venezuela or something. Like but also obviously
it's worth noting that like Janet Reno wanted to publish the manifesto because the FBI was basically completely out of ideas, right? They'd been chasing this guy. I mean, Kaczynski left clues about who he was. Sorry, I should say it differently. He left clues about who he wasn't. Right. And so he led the FBI in a bunch of different directions that were complete dead ends. And they had nothing. They had this image from the person who saw him in the parking lot or whatever it was. But really not much else. So they were desperate. And the gamble that they took ended up paying off, of course.
So how did they eventually catch him? It was because his brother outed him?
Exactly. That is why. And I believe it was his brother's wife in particular who kept telling David, I really think this is Ted, right? And David did not want to believe it. David hired a private investigator to look into it, to for example, to examine the similarities between some of the letters that Ted had written David and the manifesto. And ultimately, I believe it was when David found that shorter manifesto that he thought, like, this just has to be my brother. And so he contacted the FBI. The FBI surveilled Ted Kaczynski for a little bit, and then they posed as park rangers, I believe, and made a bunch of noise walking up to the cabin. So Ted didn't feel threatened at all. And they asked him, like, we're investigating, like, where exactly is the border in this neighboring property? Do you know? And Ted helped them out. As soon as he turned around to go back into his tiny little cabin, they snatched him and they put him in handcuffs. And then they paraded him in front of a bunch of cameras so the whole world could see. Because I very much remember, I don't really remember the bombing campaign when I was young. I was born in '82. But I definitely have memories of when he was arrested. Like, this is a big deal. It's all over the news. Americans had been kind of terrorized by this guy who seemed engaged in some kind of like quasi-stochastic terrorism for since 1978. And
also, it was I was just going to say that it was a very different time, like in the sense that everybody was paying attention to the same news.
Yes.
I remember being a little kid and seeing that O.J. Simpson white Bronco chase, the high speed chase. And I mean, it was like for there to be like this, big criminal that the cops are, trying to catch, the FBI, like everybody was in on it. Everybody's watching this story in a way that feels like it's gone now, I think, with so much news all the time and everybody consuming news from different sources.
Yeah, I totally agree. And maybe it's worth getting to his ideology now.
So just to wrap this up, he's indicted by a federal grand jury in 1996. He pleads guilty. After he's convicted, he gets a life sentence without the possibility of parole. And in 2021, he's diagnosed with rectal cancer. In 2023, he was found in his cell unresponsive. He did hang himself from a rail with a shoelace. They tried to... The emergency services tried to revive him, but he was then pronounced dead. But he was in prison for a long time.
Yeah, he was. So, his manifesto.
Okay.
As I mentioned before,
I'm excited to hear more about this. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was not an anarcho-primitivist, right? Anarcho-primitivism is this worldview according to which, to sloganize the worldview, back to the Pleistocene, right? So it's this idea that our hunter-gatherers lived lives that were actually much better than us. They had lower rates of depression, anxiety, suicide. Their health was much better than humanity's for most of civilizational history. Once the Neolithic Revolution happens, right? That was about 12,000 years ago, about 10,000 BCE. That's when we shifted to, there were some groups, the Neolithic Revolution happened different times in different regions of the world. So some people began for the first time to actually domesticate plants and animals. And interestingly enough, you see the average height of those populations fall significantly, or I should say appreciably. And so those lower height levels on average, those persisted all the way up until about the middle of the 20th century, right? So for like most of like human history, people have suffered as a result of agriculture, which is very labor intensive. It tends to be less nutritious than if you are hunting, gathering, and fishing. So anarcho-primitivists point to things like this. Actually, I'll add one last quote. Jared Diamond, who is like one of the pioneers of collapsology. Kind of controversial figure. I have very mixed feelings about him.
He's the guy that wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel?
Exactly. Yes.
Is that him?
Yes.
Okay.
And he published an article in, I can't remember what Science magazine it was, but he claimed that agriculture was the single worst mistake that humans have ever made. So anarcho-primitivists very much agree with that. Therefore, we ought to return to the life ways of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, right? And so Kaczynski, his main focus was, like I was saying before, it's industrialization. It's all of the megatechnics that pervade every aspect of our lives, and in his view, severely restrict our freedom to for self-determination or whatever. And so, he was very much like in the tradition of Jacques Ellul. If some listeners have ever come across that name, he was I think he was a theologian, a French theologian, who wrote some pretty insightful critiques of modern technology. Maybe Lewis Mumford
Yeah.
is also in the same kind of tradition. So interestingly, Kaczynski starts and ends his manifesto complaining about leftists. Right? So he
Yeah.
hates leftists. He hates political correctness. If the term woke had existed back in the 90s, he would be railing against wokeness, right? And he would be describing himself as an anti-woke crusader. And he has some kind of like convoluted views that even when I reread the Unabomber manifesto recently, I couldn't really piece together all of his different ideas. So like he's connecting leftism in some way with a technological society. But basically, his claim is that we live in this vast network of technologies, and these technologies increasingly encroach upon our freedom. They control our lives. He's reiterating, ideas from the latter 20th century about how we have become in this techno-capitalist system, cogs in the machine, and we struggle to find meaning and purpose because we're just essentially means to an end. We're just these fungible units that can be replaced at will for the purpose of corporations that are trying to make money. So he makes this distinction between small-scale technologies and organization-dependent technologies. Small-scale technologies are the ones that individuals with minimal skills could craft if, for example, civilization collapsed. Right, people would still be able to build like water wheels is like one of his examples, or tools that are necessary for plowing crops, etc. But these larger like organization dependent technologies, they require a vast infrastructure, a huge network of different technologies in order to operate, and manufacturing them requires many steps. So his argument is that you can't reform this system, right? You can't delete this or that component of the system because all of these components are interrelated. You can't get rid of we're going to eliminate the mining of certain minerals, right? Because if you do that, you eliminate like electronics, and there are whole industries that would be massively affected. So that is why he argues that reform is not possible. You can't selectively or preferentially and in a surgical manner, remove certain technologies that are problematic and leave the other technologies you might want to stick around in place. No, they're all mutually dependent upon each other in some way. So hence, what you need is a hard reboot. You need to just get rid of of the megatechnics altogether. And in many ways, he is an early AI doomer. Right, so this gets at the interesting connection between him and the test grill movement. We mentioned before that there are two camps within the test grill movement. One is the doomer camp, and the other is the accelerationist camp.
Let's take 1 second to give a really brief definition of test grill in case anyone is just tuning in for the first time. Well, this is a set of ideologies in Silicon Valley, commonly held by billionaires, that basically have to do with transforming humanity into digital beings, colonizing space. And Emil has made this acronym for all these different ideologies. And we all the main billionaires that you see in tech, Zuckerberg, Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, these guys are all believers in this ideology. It's prevalent. It's not uncommon.
Yes, absolutely. It's pervasive in Silicon Valley. In many ways, it's the water that valley dwellers swim in. It's the air they breathe. Right. And
it's what this show is about for the most part.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
This podcast. Yeah.
And so you're totally right. There are many adherents to this kind of tech utopian vision. And the transformation of humanity need not result in the replacement of our species with digital beings, right? Because there are some test gorilla's out there, like Peter Thiel, who actually oppose the digitization of the human organism. They want to keep their biological bodies, but they still want to use advanced technology to radically re-engineer us, to create a post-human species.
Yeah.
So the idea is
Yeah.
humanity needs to transition to a post-human state. Those post-humans could take many different forms. They could be biological beings, they could be cyborgs, they could be purely digital entities in the form of
Yeah.
AGIs or uploaded minds and so on. And so within this movement, you have two groups of people who are diametrically opposed on one and pretty much only one issue. And that is the dangerousness of developing very advanced AI in the near future, right? So the doomers say the default outcome, if we develop AGI under anything like the current circumstances, is complete annihilation. And along with that, the erasure of our post-human utopian future, right? The accelerationists say, oh no, the risk is really low. And so all of that is to set up the point that I was making a moment ago, which is that in a sense, like Kaczynski is kind of an early AI doomer. He is worried about the possibility of like AI taking over. He doesn't talk about the singularity in his manifesto, but he does argue that we might end up in a situation where we incrementally, in a piecemeal fashion, we offload more and more tasks to AI. And before we know it, we are completely dependent upon the AI who, maybe at this point is making decisions for us because we are just not able to make them anymore. We are not embedded in the right way within the megatechnics to make those decisions. The AIs are, right? And so it might even be worth reading two long-ish paragraphs from the Unabomber manifesto. So this will take just a couple minutes, but I think it's worth hearing what Kaczynski himself wrote. Also, in part because these two paragraphs were reproduced in Ray Kurzweil's 1999 book, The Age of Spiritual Machines, right? And Kurzweil—
Oh, that's so cool. I didn't realize we did a back-to-back thematic Kurzweil-Kaczynski.
Yes.
Yeah, we got to check out the episode right before this if you want to know more.
Yeah, we talk about that 1999 book. So in the book, Kurzweil reproduces these paragraphs, and only once you flip the page do you find out that Ted Kaczynski wrote them. Because, of course, Kurzweil doesn't want us to, our opinion, our interpretation of the text to be colored by our knowledge that Kaczynski was, this homicidal maniac was the author. Because his argument, I mean, aside from his really just hyperventilating about leftists and what we now call wokeism, as well as his like patently horrendous immoral behavior. Some of the points he makes in his manifesto, like there's some substance there. And in fact, it is, we'll mention Bill Joy in just a moment. It's people like Bill Joy, co-founder of Sun Microsystems, a famous technologist who ended up being influenced by Kaczynski's views. So here are the three paragraphs, but the first one is short, that Kaczynski wrote. All right, first, let us postulate that the computer scientists succeed in developing intelligent machines that can do all things better than human beings can do them. In that case, presumably all work will be done by vast, highly organized systems of machines, and no human effort will be necessary. Either of two cases might occur. Machines might be permitted to make all of their own decisions without human oversight, or else human control over the machines might be retained. All right, paragraph number 2. If the machines are permitted to make all their own decisions, we can't make any conjectures as to the results, because it is impossible to guess how such machines might behave. We only point out, by we he means him, because he's the only author.
Yeah, because he's pretending to be a collective, basically, for a lot of this, right?
The Freedom Club. Yes. So he says—
the Freedom Club. FC. Yeah.
He says, we only point out that the fate of the human race would be at the mercy of the machines. It might be argued that the human race would never be foolish enough to hand over all the power to the machines. But we are suggesting neither that the human race would voluntarily turn power over to the machines, nor that the machines would willfully seize power. And just as a side note, so that's an interesting difference between contemporary AI doomerism and the kind of doomerism that he is delineating here, right? Because many people like Yudkowsky and and so on, they are concerned that once we build AI that is as or more intelligent, quote unquote, intelligent than humans, it will by force take over the world and destroy humanity.
Yeah.
So just an interesting little divergence in views. So Kaczynski continues, what we do suggest is that the human race might easily permit itself to drift into a position of such dependence on the machines that it would have no practical choice but to accept all of the machine's decisions. As society and the problems that face it become more and more complex and machines become more and more intelligent, people will let machines make more of their decisions for them, simply because machine-made decisions will bring better results than man-made ones. Eventually, a stage may be reached at which the decisions necessary to keep the system running will be so complex that human beings will be incapable of making them intelligently. At that stage, the machine will be in effective control. People won't be able to just turn the machines off because they will be so dependent on them that turning them off would amount to suicide. Okay, here's the last paragraph. All right. On the other,
I'm getting a lot out of this. He sounds more coherent than I thought he would, I guess. Yeah. Like, you see that guy coming out of the cabin in handcuffs, and you're not like, oh, this dude has an intelligent critique. But, he was very intelligent in certain ways,
When they picked him up, they said that he was so filthy that the FBI agents who handled him physically had, like, soot, basically like soot on their hands afterwards.
Ugh.
Yeah, I know. Okay, so
ugh, men. Yeah.
So that's the guy writing this.
Yeah.
He says, on the other hand, it is possible that human control over the machines may be retained. In that case, so this is the other possibility. The first one was we lose control.
Yeah.
The second one is we continue to control the machines. In that case, the average man may have control over certain private machines of his own, such as his car or his personal computer, but control over large systems of machines will be in the hands of a tiny elite, just as it is today, but with two differences. Due to improved techniques, the elite will have greater control over the masses. And because human work will no longer be necessary, the masses will be superfluous, a useless burden on the system. If the elite is ruthless, they may simply decide to exterminate the mass of humanity. If they are humane, they may use propaganda or other psychological, biological techniques to reduce the birth rate until the mass of humanity becomes extinct, leaving the world to the elite. Or if the elite consists of soft-hearted liberals, again, he hates liberals, they may decide to play the role
Me too, but in a different way.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
He hates leftists and liberals. I'm a leftist who kind of hates liberals. Yeah.
Same.
Yeah.
But also, we love our liberal listeners. Thanks for listening to the show.
Yes.
We don't mean you. We don't mean you. We mean like,
What do we mean? Oh no.
Well, I think
We're digging a hole now.
rich liberals. Well, no. I mean, I think like, to me, I guess if I'm like throwing some hate at libs, I mean like rich liberals who are like, oh, like Joe Biden's ice cages were so much better. It's like,
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
get rid of the fucking ice cages.
Yeah.
No, none of them. That's what I mean. Yeah.
Okay, so continuing with the manifesto, Kaczynski writes, or if the elite consists of soft-hearted liberals, they may decide to play the role of good shepherds to the rest of the human race. They will see to it that everyone's physical needs are satisfied, that all children are raised under psychologically hygienic conditions, that everyone has a wholesome hobby to keep him busy, and that anyone who may become dissatisfied undergoes treatment to cure his quote-unquote problem. Of course, life will be so purposeless that people will have to be biologically or psychologically engineered either to remove their need for the power process, what he calls the power process, he has this whole theory about that, or make them sublimate their drive for power into harmless hobby. Hobby, singular. These engineered human beings may be happy in such a society, but they will almost certainly not be free. And they will have been reduced to the status of domestic animals. So these are the paragraphs that Kurzweil quotes in his book. And interestingly, they were later picked up and reproduced by Bill Joy, who I mentioned earlier. Bill Joy was very well known in like Silicon Valley back in the day. I think he might be a billionaire. He has a ton of money if he's not a billionaire. But he says that he dates his anxiety to anxiety about emerging technologies, including AI, to a specific meeting he had with Kurzweil, where Kurzweil was talking about how we're going to merge with machines, we're going to develop these advanced AIs, they're going to run everything, and ultimately we're going to experience the singularity, which he later predicted would happen in 2045, which will usher in this kind of utopian world. And Bill Joy thought, I think Kurzweil might be underestimating the risks. So Bill Joy, like having read Kaczynski's manifesto, he draws from it, draws some inspiration from it, while simultaneously.
Well, that's a sign of success in academia, right? Where others are citing you as a source.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, Bill Joy, like he is very clear and unequivocal that he does not endorse the strategy or tactics of Kaczynski, but like he just does draw some inspiration in saying like, yeah, actually these technologies, like they could be really dangerous. They could severely undermine our freedom. They could result in the extermination of our species. And so maybe they're so dangerous that we shouldn't develop them. We should impose what were later called broad moratoria, or actually the term was broad relinquishment. We should broadly relinquish entire domains of emerging science and technology, in particular genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics, GNR technologies. And robotics is umbrella term that subsumes AI. And so the reason I'm mentioning this is that these are the early whispers of AI doomerism, right? And in a certain way, they kind of trace back to Ted Kaczynski's manifesto. And to be clear, for any like historians who might be listening, fear of the robots, that does have a much longer history, for sure. I mean, it goes back, there was a play by a Czech playwright, as I recall. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but I know it, who introduced the term robot. And going all the way back to the 1800s, there was Samuel Butler, who published an article that was titled Darwin Among the Machines. And he argued that basically there's going to be a kind of Darwinian, natural selection process that will cause machines to evolve into increasingly sophisticated forms. And at some point in the future, they will have the capacity to completely take over the world. And that is why we should revolt against the machines right now, right? And so, Butler's, his surname gave the author of Dune the term.
Butlerian jihad.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So Butlerian jihad is something that AI doomers talk about, right?
Yeah.
So there's this really interesting...
And I think it's something that leftist critics of tech will jokingly talk about as well, right?
Yes.
Like there's something that sounds good about that,
yes.
especially right now. Yeah.
I've used it on occasion. And so, Bill Joy published this article in 2000, drawing from Ray Kurzweil, drawing from Ted Kaczynski, arguing that we need to stop or ban, impose a moratorium on AI and other emerging technologies. And that initiates, as it happens, his article, his sort of neo-Luddite manifesto, if you will, was published on April 1st of all dates, in Wired of all magazines, right? So,
and you were like, "Is this guy fucking joking?" Yeah.
But he wasn't. And so this ignited a public debate between the transhumanists, singularitarians, extropians, the early TESCREAL individuals, right? T stands for transhumanism, E for extropianism, S for singularitarianism, and then the kind of neo-Luddite people like Bill Joy. And he gave the neo-Luddite position a lot of credibility by virtue of the fact that he was this very wealthy, very successful technologist, co-founder of Sun Microsystems. And so there's just this vicious debate about whether or not we should actually ban the development of certain technologies like advanced AI. And what for me at least, what is really interesting about this is there were a bunch of people who were on the side of the transhumanists, who ended up, so there's a kind of irony to the narrative arc here, who ended up more recently over the past several years, more or less agreeing with Bill Joy. So like Eliezer Yudkowsky, hardcore singularitarian, extropian, transhumanist, etc., who now like there are differences between his view and the view of Bill Joy, but at least in the near term, like over the coming decades, his view aligns almost perfectly with Bill Joy's. And so there's this weird genealogy that you can trace. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to draw out this genealogy that goes from Yudkowsky to Bill Joy, Kurzweil, Kaczynski, right?
So one thing I was thinking about as you were talking, especially about Kurzweil and Joy versus Kaczynski, is, a big thing that all of these dudes have in common is they don't have a critique of capitalism.
Yes.
Obviously for the billionaires, they're like, capitalism is awesome. Why would I ever critique it? But, it's notably absent from Kaczynski's work. As you mentioned, he hates leftists. But what he's talking about, what I hear him describing in the paragraphs that you mentioned and that you read, and also, throughout the manifesto, is sort of this sense of alienation.
Yeah.
And obviously he lived his life in a way that you would have called him a very alienated individual.
Yeah.
But he doesn't see that alienation as a result of capitalism. He sees it as a result of technology and industrial systems. Yeah. That we human beings are meant for this small scale, autonomous living, this primitive, back to the woods kind of, lifestyle, even if it's at like a massive human cost. Like when Karl Marx talks about alienation, he sees it as a huge problem that people are alienated from each other, from their labor, from the labor process, from our true nature as human beings, creativity, connection with one another. But he doesn't see technology as the enemy, but rather the misuse of technology. The fact that capitalists own the technology and use it to control the workers, which in my understanding was kind of like the actual Luddites, they weren't anti-technology either. They wanted to own the means of production and have it be used to benefit workers. But it's like Kaczynski is he's not thinking about that at all. He hates leftists. Yeah. So and I think that maybe there is something useful about focusing on Kaczynski for these billionaires who don't want to talk about redistributing wealth and power in our society in a real way.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, Kaczynski is constantly talking about the system, a term that appeared in the excerpt that I read, and it's not totally clear what exactly he means by the system. If the way I described his view earlier, like 20, 30 minutes ago, was we're cogs in the machine. We live lives that are in many ways devoid of meaning and purpose, and our will is subjugated to the single-minded will of corporations. Which is, of course, to maximize profit, to maximize shareholder value, is the way we put it now. And so I don't know if that's. I wonder if I could have articulated that a little bit better, because he doesn't really foreground capitalism in his manifesto. But I think there is an interpretation of the system as techno-capitalism, even though he hates leftists. He hates collectivism. So what he wants.
Yeah, he hates socialism.
He hates socialism, right? Any kind of collectivist approach to improving human welfare is fundamentally misguided in his view. And I think what he wants is this kind of radical individualism that is tied to or bound up with small-scale technologies only. Right, so you have maximum freedom.
Libertarianism goes too far.
Yes, I mean, literally. While I was reading the manifesto, I was just like, I thought about the term libertarianism a bunch of times. It's just like this is like radical libertarianism. And by the way, so I know we've moved on, but if I may loop back to something we were talking about just a moment ago, the interesting kind of genealogical connections between Yudkowsky and Kaczynski. There's one last thing to mention, which is that nobody in the doomer camp of the test grill movement has engaged in violence, with maybe one exception, the Zizians. But
Are they? Yeah, I guess they are doomers. Yeah. Yeah.
I think so.
They're like doomers, but also accelerationists too. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
But interestingly, Yudkowsky has endorsed property damage targeting AI companies on social media. Somebody asked him whether he would be willing to bomb the laboratories at Wuhan to prevent the COVID-19 pandemic, because Yudkowsky seems to think that the lab leak hypothesis is the most probable one, which it seems that doesn't seem to be the case as far as I could tell. But anyways, his response was, yes, I probably would, and that I would have gone and thrown up a little bit, because it's, bombing a place is terrible, but I probably would have done it. He also said that states should be willing to engage in targeted military strikes to prevent AI data centers, rogue AI data centers, from, potentially producing in artificial general intelligence in the near future. So he said, even at the risk of triggering a thermonuclear war. So this is really, really extreme rhetoric that is not completely different from the sort of thing, the sort of actions that Ted Kaczynski engaged in. In fact, at the end of 2022, there was an individual who leaked to me the meeting minutes of a workshop that was organized by 3 individuals, one of whom worked for Open Philanthropy, which is a major test grill organization. Another who...
I think that they have rebranded, actually. I think just really, really super recently, Open Philanthropy changed their name.
I think
we can
so
put a
too.
pin in that.
Yeah.
I'll just look it up really quick.
Another one worked for MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, which was founded by Yudkowsky, originally called the Singularity Institute. And so I mention this because in the meeting minutes, people were brainstorming ways to slow down AI capabilities research so that AI safety research can catch up. And they literally said, kill all AI researchers and, quote, become Kaczynski. Somebody else said...
just a casual brainstorm.
yeah. Another person said, move to a cabin in Montana, which is where Kaczynski was, and mail bombs to AI companies. So this is another really interesting and kind of eerie connection between the contemporary AI doomer movement or camp within the test grill movement and Ted Kaczynski and his campaign his terror campaign, motivated in part by his fear that AI is going to take over the world and and bring about some kind of dystopian future.
I mean, you can see how it goes there, right?
Yeah.
I think that the AI doomer thinking leads one to those sorts of conclusions, not just, as we always talk about, the stakes of utopia versus, total annihilation, but also that missing critique of capitalism that, I am kind of evangelical about socialism. I will say that, but, whether or not you're actually a socialist, the idea that we could have a better world together by thinking about the collective well-being and working together differently. None of these people believe that. And I think that that's sort of necessary to have a critique of technology that doesn't lead you to these weird antisocial places.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really funny that the AI, so, Kaczynski, his view was the way we ought to deal with the looming catastrophic threat posed by AI is to dismantle all of the megatechnics of our industrial society. People in the contemporary AI doomer movement, they are libertarians about basically everything except for AI, right? In fact, they are, they would describe themselves as accelerationists about all technologies except for maybe advanced genetic technology, nanotechnology, and AGI. So that's a, there's an interesting difference there, an important difference between the two views. And also, maybe it's worth highlighting another interesting historical event. If you go back to the 2000s, if you go back to the year 2000, when Bill Joy published his article that drew from Ray Kurzweil and Ted Kaczynski, you ended up with this debate about the future of humanity and whether or not we should develop these technologies, as I mentioned before. Okay, the reason I bring this up is if basically all of the discussants, all of the individuals who are participating in this debate agreed about something, which is that advanced technology could pose an existential threat to humanity and our post-human future. So that's kind of interesting. Kurzweil, Yudkowsky, all of them agreed about that. Where the disagreement arose was in what, with respect to what our response ought to be to this situation, right? So Bill Joy's response was shut it all down, right? Which is literally what Yudkowsky now says: shut it all down. Too dangerous to develop, broad relinquishment. People like Yudkowsky and his colleague Nick Bostrom, who's one of the most influential test realists around today, their response was no. What we should do is continue to develop these technologies, or this is the response at the time, continue to develop these technologies, but also found an entirely new field. We'll call it existential risk studies. And so this new field is tasked with studying the nature, underlying cause or etiology, consequences, and so on of risks, of disasters that could be the result of advanced technologies, in order to figure out ways of neutralizing the associated risks, right? So that is the reason that the term existential risk was introduced. It's the reason that the field of existential risk studies came about, because their response was, look, Bill Joy, if we broadly relinquish these entire domains of science and technology, then we never get utopia. Why? Because utopia, or techno-utopia, cannot be established without advanced technology. So failing to develop these technologies itself would be an existential catastrophe, defined as anything that prevents us from reaching utopia. What we need to do instead is develop them in a maximally safe way. And that is the job of existential risk studies. That's the field that I was in since about 2009 up until roughly 2019. Right? All my papers were on existential risk.
Yeah.
And so there's an interesting...
Hey, sometimes you change jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just having a career change. Yeah.
So everybody agreed these technologies are incredibly risky. Some said shut it all down. Others said no. Well, existential risk studies will determine a path that enables us to slalom through the obstacle course. And then to recap what I was saying before, people like Yudkowsky have sort of come full circle, and now they're saying shut it all down.
Yeah. Wow. I do sometimes think that these people need to talk to other people who are not extremely nerdy men that are rich, you know? They're having a very insular conversation.
It's very insular and very incestuous. It's very silent.
Right. And I mean, and like, you know, I think just even that idea of existential risk, like, a lot of it makes sense. Like, hey, let's not do something that could kill everyone on the planet. Nuclear war comes to mind.
Yeah.
Like, I think, you know, nuclear non-proliferation, very important. We should focus on that. We should think about how to develop vaccines and prevent the next pandemic, all that stuff. But what these folks add to it is that it's an existential risk to not develop all these weird new technologies, I think, you know, like, so, and that's where they need some feedback from others, you know, like, oh, stopping nuclear war really is more important than robots, you know, like.
And the other thing to emphasize here is that their notion of existential risk it was explicitly defined initially in a transhumanist context. It's any event that prevents us from creating a post-human civilization that would basically be utopian. So when they think about these like global scale catastrophe scenarios, they honestly don't really care about the 8 billion people who would die. Right?
Yeah.
Because when you compare the 8 billion people 8.2 billion now who would die if there was like a thermonuclear war, you know, next year, that pales in comparison to all of the future digital people, digital space brains who would be lost, right? And all of that future value being gone forever, that is so much worse than 8.2 billion people dying a horrible death. So just to distinguish between two ways that one could care about, I'll say it again, just to distinguish between two reasons that one could care about avoiding nuclear war, right? Like for me,
Yeah.
I just don't want 8.2 billion people to suffer. I mean, that's just
Yeah.
unimaginably horrendous possible end to humanity. They're casting their eyes on the very far future. They're saying, well, I'm going to upload my mind. I'll get to live forever, because I'll have a cyber immortality, and there will be all this value, in a utopian future, and so on. So it's just very, very different perspectives. And one way to summarize this is, if you care about avoiding human extinction, especially like a catastrophic human extinction caused by a catastrophe, that does not mean that you are aligned with the test crealists, right? There are other reasons to care about avoiding nuclear war or avoiding an AI takeover if that becomes plausible at some point in the future.
I mean, I think to close this out, really what I'm getting out of this conversation is of all the people that we have discussed today, I am not sure that Ted Kaczynski has the most violent beliefs,
Yeah.
They were certainly violent, but I'm not sure, I think he's in good company, to say the least, I guess,
Yeah. I think the doomer camp in the test reel movement is a ticking time bomb. I hope I'm wrong about that. But if I had to bet money, I would say at some point, like in the next 5 years, somebody's going to do something that is really harmful, is violent, etc. Maybe if the AI bubble pops, that won't be the case. And suddenly all the doomers will be able to exhale and say, oh, okay, maybe, super intelligence is not just right around the temporal corner. But if the AI bubble doesn't pop, and there continues to be incremental progress, or at least if there continues to be developments that are perceived as progress towards superintelligence, then I think something bad is going to happen. Something that is maybe reminiscent of what Kaczynski engaged in.
Well, let's, I guess, close out on that optimistic note. I do want to say thank you so much to our Patreon supporters who do make this show possible.
Including
especially
liberals.
Including liberals, maybe even some libertarians. Look, okay, the main thing that we all share in common here is no just straight up sociopathy, okay? Yeah. We don't like ICE. We don't like nuclear war. There's a lot that we share, even across ideologies. But I do want to say thank you so much, especially to our newest supporters, Fran, Mertsunami, Kate, Paco, and Tom. Welcome. And thanks so much. We have a few great episodes coming out on Patreon that I just edited, a few in the can. So we'll have an episode on Ray Kurzweil that we just talked about. We'll have an episode on Stop AI. There's some good stuff in the pipeline. Become a subscriber. And we thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.